Very excited to be able to kick this series off, reflecting on New Testament characters. I got the lovely choice of getting to do Paul. Paul's one of my favorite characters. Oddly, I've never taught about him. May have taught a class or two just on some different subjects around Paul. Filled in a few times, I think, when they've gone into depth on Paul in a class, but I've never really taught a lesson on Paul. So when that name came up, I said, I've got to teach on Paul, because I always say how much I love this character. I love Paul. He's one of my favorites. So I got to teach on Paul. I'm very excited and blessed to be able to speak with these other fellow brothers of mine. Of course, you got Sam doing James right after me here in the theater about an hour. You got Aaron doing Zacchaeus tonight. Luke doing Mary and Joseph. That'd be a very interesting topic. We don't usually hear just them two together. Normally a topic just on Mary and Joseph. Kyle doing Barnabas, and Brother Bellwood doing Stephen. Should be a great series on these New Testament characters. Certainly I hope to lead that off in a good way. As we get into Paul, this man just astonishes me on the life that he once lived and the life that became him, that he worked to achieve after spending so many years living a life that he thought was right, but being so far from the truth. We're actually going to go in slightly reverse order in the sense of his life. We're actually going to end with where he started, but there was a lot of directions I thought I could go with Paul, because he's basically enforcing half of the New Testament, if not more, right? And we're about to get into some of the books he wrote. But his characteristics, we talked so much in depth in different books he's done, different passages of Scripture, but I can't remember a lot of times where we've just gone over just some of the great characteristics this man had throughout his life that I think sometimes, and maybe I'm the only one here that thinks this way, where I look at Paul and I'm like, some of the things he does are unachievable. Like he's so incredibly good at some of the things and such the impact he had. How can I be like him? When you look at some of his characteristics, I think they all are not something we should strive to achieve. I think they're things that as Christians we should have a reflection of in our lives. So as we get into this, I do want to give one other warning. I've taught multiple classes. I've done multiple of these lessons. I've never done a lesson for the class like this, where we start the meeting off. So I caught myself multiple times as I was preparing the other day saying, let's stand and sing. So if I say that, please don't stand and sing. And I got my wonderful wife back there, I think even has a sign for me to make sure I don't do that. But sure enough, I'll still do it. Because obviously at the end of this lesson, we're still going to be extending an invitation here. Never should anybody feel that they ever have to wait for a proper time to come forward if they need to in their life. And certainly that can be during my lesson, that can be right now, that could be any time, but certainly that will be extended at the end of this. So let's get into Paul. The first characteristic I want to talk about with Paul is when I think of Paul, we think of all the missionary journeys he had, and we're actually not going to get into much of those because that's what I remember in a lot of the classes is all his missionary journeys. So we're, like I said, more of his characteristics, and I got 7 ones I want to talk about. This first one, I think about so much with Paul, just the great speaker he must have been, how people were drawn to him, and how he set up these churches, and how much knowledge he had. Obviously, he was a very educated man, learned under Gamaliel. We'll get to that later. He obviously was a very moving speaker, and obviously gave everything he could for giving God's truth. But what we don't think about sometimes, and I had to catch myself thinking that most of the teaching that I think about with Paul was not done by word of mouth. A lot of it was done in letter form. a lot of it was done by his example. And we're going to get into some of that. Debatable. Of course, we don't know for sure, but roughly 13 books written by Paul, Hebrews being one of the books in debate. 13 books written by Paul, possibly 15 letters. We think 1st and 2nd Corinthians may have had a reference to 4 different letters. Of course, you got 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and part of the way through 2nd Corinthians, it looks like there shifts to be another letter, and there was a reference in Corinthians to being a initial letter. And who knows about the countless letters that are not recorded that Paul wrote to the brethren. So think about that. 13 books, 15 letters. How many books are in the New Testament, kids? 27. Almost half the books this man is responsible for, and like I said, debatably more than half, that this man's responsible for. So his impact is so profound in the New Testament. If we go to 1 Corinthians 5:9, I did want to reference just real quick that it says, "I wrote to you my letter not to associate with immoral people." So that's where I got where it seems to be there potentially was another letter. Once again, there's debate on that. So by my count, possibly 15 letters this man wrote that we have. So 50% of the New Testament, and just the impact that we can have through writings. So I think sometimes that, we think we got to lead devotions, Bible studies, and all those things are necessary. Bridgman will kill me if I get up here and say that. That's not a thing. That is so important, so necessary. Preaching lessons, teaching Bible classes, devotionals, all those things 100% need to be done. But I think when we send a card or if we send an email to a preacher for encouragement or we do all these things, that they don't have a profound impact. Obviously, Paul has proven to us that words mean so much, and it doesn't matter where they're written from. It matters the content of what's going on in them. I also want to say that he taught by example. So if we go over to Acts chapter 16, I want to read this story. This story everybody knows well, but I want to read it again. I love this story about the Philippian jailer. We'll read it quickly. Acts chapter 16, verse 23. Says, "When they had struck him with many blows, they threw him into prison, commanding the jailer," this be the Philippian jailer, "to guard them securely. And he, having received such a command, threw them in the inner prison, fastened their feet in stocks. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundation of the prison house were shaken. Immediately all the doors were opened, everyone's chains were unfastened. When the jailer awoke and saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword, was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, 'Do not harm yourself, for we are all in here.' He called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. And after he brought them out, he said, 'Sirs, what must I do to be saved?' They said, 'Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household.' And they spoke the word of the Lord to him together with all who were in his house. And he took them that very hour of the night and washed their wounds. And immediately he was baptized, he and all his household. It would seem weird to me to think that the Philippian jailer saw chains unfastened and saw the bonds gone, and he just said, 'I just want to become baptized right now.' Obviously, this man had some point, and more than likely, right before they were put in prison, had heard of Paul, heard about his reputation, heard about this God he was preaching of, heard about the new law, heard about something. He's gotten wind of this somewhere. And more than likely, his work he had done here in Philippi. And even though it mentions that this man was asleep, the Philippian jailer obviously asleep, I think it would be not too far of a stretch to think that he heard Paul and them praying and singing in the temple. And how weird would that be to you that you hear guys singing in the most depressing place you can be, knowing they're thrown in prison, possibly beaten right before that? Well, that's a very odd attitude. So Paul's teaching about how you're supposed to live for God, live for Christ before this, it's not going to have much of an impact if you don't also live it. And part of living it was what he did in this jail cell. And not only him, but those with him. So I want you to think of the impact, because if that wasn't what the Philippian jailer thought was interesting, the final kicker was that Paul and them did not go anywhere when those prison doors were opened. I mean, who knows what could have happened to Paul after that? Days after that. I mean, they were enraged with Paul. And he went nowhere. You know, people can argue different things. I think Paul had a main target in hand there, and that was the Philippian jailer. I mean, who would think of converting the person that threw them in prison? Paul lived every second of every day, no matter the circumstance, by an example. We don't have to be great speakers and preachers and teachers to convert. We just need devotion to God and showing Christ in our lives an example every day. The Philippian jailer was converted because he had the whole package with Paul. The whole thing came around full circle, and the Philippian jailer said, I want some of that. Whatever's causing you to do this right here, I want some of that. And Paul had him. The jailer wanted to be what Paul was giving out. Excellent example of how we can be teachers, not just by word of mouth, by so many other forms. Our example, okay, the way we communicate with others. It does not have to be a profound thing to be a converter. So, like I said, if you think cards of encouragement sent to people don't have an impact, think again. If you think being a great example can't just have much of an impact, think again. Paul shows us that in his life, that we don't have to be that way. Second characteristic is this man had countless devotion. Let's go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And I say countless devotion because this man, whether it was in his prior life or his current life, whatever he latched onto, that man took it and ran with it. Okay? It's a great characteristic in life unless you run in the wrong direction. So let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 21. It says, to my shame I must say that we have been weak by comparison, but whatever respect anyone else is bold, I speak in foolishness, I am just as bold myself. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane, I more so, in far more labors and far more imprisonments, beaten times without number. Pay attention. Often in danger of death. 5 times I received the Jews 39 lashes. 5 times 39. 5 times 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Well, obviously, most didn't live through that. We got Brother Bell was speaking on Stephen. He did not live through that. 39 was beaten with rods. Once was stoned. 3 times shipwrecked. A night and a day I spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from countrymen, dangers from Gentiles, dangers in cities, dangers in wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights and hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, so let's stop there. Apart from the things that are so easy, there is daily pressure. Interesting, he mentions, he puts on equal ground the pressure he has for all the churches, the daily concern. How do you know you love your brethren? You compare beatings and shipwrecks and all these things to how much you care for them and how much pressure it is knowing that, I hope this church is okay today. That's how devoted this man was. Who is weak without me being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? If I have to boast, I'll boast of what pertains to my weakness. How odd is it in this society today? I believe Michael mentioned in his Beatitudes lesson. How odd does the world see you today if you're saying, I rejoice in suffering? Okay, let's go over to Romans chapter 5. This man went through some suffering. So I wanted to list the sufferings he went through before we read these other verses here. So Romans 5, verse 3. And not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance proven character, and proven character hope. Go back over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 6. For if I do wish to boast, I will not be foolish, for if I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain from this, so that no one will credit me with more than what he sees or hears from me, because the surpassing greatness of the revelation, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. He said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I may be well content with weakness, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. For weakness today, you need a pill, okay? That's what you need. To take care of all your weaknesses, to forget all your stresses, to forget all your problems, just put them in the backside of your brain and take some medicine to get rid of it. Or go get a self-help book. Or just try not to think about it. It's eventually just not becoming a problem anymore. Paul said you need to understand your weaknesses, you need to take them and use them as a strength. Paul's always looked at the qualities of what suffering produces. Number one, and most importantly, Christ sees it as you're doing this for me. You're suffering for me. Paul saw that as a blessing to even be counted as a sufferer for Christ. So his weaknesses are blessings to him. How odd is that? How much devotion do you have to say, this suffering, I'm so excited that I'm suffering because I know it's for Christ's sake. And not only that, your weakness produces something. It produces you now to be stronger because you know how to be better now. You've seen where the weakness has taken you. You've seen how you can beat it. You've seen how you can grow stronger. These weaknesses can make you stronger, or they can bring you down. It's however you want to look at them. How much better can we handle sufferings if we come to terms, use these trials to shape and mold us to be better soldiers for God? One more verse pertaining to this, James chapter 1. Just to back up what Paul said here, James 1. Verse 2, Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. I don't really know exactly how to fully interpret everything that's said there, but it appears to me that trials can eventually produce a complete Christian, lacking in nothing. Doesn't mean perfect, or all going to make mistakes. This allows us to keep growing. Isn't that an odd concept is there any way you would ever hear any self-help speaker in this world say, you just keep pouring on the weaknesses, it's going to help you grow? There is no way you'll ever hear that today. But that's what God tells us. That's what Paul is saying. Count it all joy. Weaknesses. Paul had countless devotion to God. You see through all the things he went through, and considered those weaknesses strengths because they're blessings that he can serve God. We don't have to read far in Paul. Our next characteristic, to see that he didn't live to please man. If we go over to Galatians chapter 1, in verse 6, it says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we are angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again, if any man is preaching you a gospel contrary to what you hear, he is to be accursed. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. Turn really quickly over to Ephesians chapter 6. In verse 6, it says, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. Paul was extremely blunt when preaching the gospel. This man brought himself down to levels sometimes to help with his teaching. He obviously ate a certain way or knew how to be around certain people to make sure they paid attention. But when he was speaking, it was the truth. And it was blunt, very blunt. at times. There was no sugarcoating. This man clearly is telling them, how hard is it to look at your fellow brethren, fellow friends, and say, you guys are people-pleasing. You guys are following after man. Do not let your ears get tickled. Are you living to please man, or are you living to please God? Paul realized there's two choices. Every day of your life, that is your choice. We're either living to please the world, or we're living to please God. Paul couldn't care less about what people thought of him or wanted to do for his teachings. We're going to get next couple of characteristics. We'll get into why that is, because of the goals he had in his life. I want to ask you, how much time have we wasted over the years in worrying what others think of us? I mean, that appears to be such a problem around the world, but definitely in this country. Everybody is so concerned. And it ain't just you guys. I know you guys are, all you guys right here dealing with peer pressure and all, worried about, I don't want to be the kid that's not cool and not being part of the group. Let me tell you something. Adults, older people, they all deal with the same thing. They deal with it at work. They deal with it around their family. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to do the wrong thing. They don't want to be the person that's not popular. It is a problem that we have really badly in this country. And also among Christians, among churches. If not careful, when you go down the track of pleasing man, as Paul saw, you start molding your entire life around it. It's like getting on the tracks and you can't get off of them. It is something we have to really look at and say, who am I trying to please? You can only see that in the mirror for yourself. And if every day it's not an aim to please God, well then the only other default is you're there to please the world, please man. Paul saw that there's no way he can do what he's doing. There's no way his message is going to land. There's no way he can be the Christian he needs to be if his first focus before I teach one word is I'm here to please God only. Really quickly, Proverbs 29:25, just to drive that point home. Proverbs 29. The fear of man brings a snare, but he who trusts in the Lord will be exalted. Don't put the stock in this world. It's going to give you nothing. Don't put the stock in what people think of you, who you're going to conform to. Am I part of this group or this clique or whatever? That is not going to get you anywhere. God can. God is going to get you somewhere. Paul realized that. Paul was part of the groups, part of the churches. Consider them his friends. Consider them his fellow brethren. But he wasn't conforming to them. He was still preaching hard to them. He was still telling them what he thought. Tell them how to fix their issues. Telling them what it takes to follow God. Because he loved them. He saw some of these groups conforming to men. Great characteristic of Paul. Never lived to please man. Next characteristic. It's a great one of Paul. We don't think of this much of Paul. We don't see it a lot throughout the New Testament, but this man is very willing to admit his faults. If we go over to Romans chapter 7, begins 14. For we know that the law is spiritual. So Romans 7, verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I am practicing, what I would like to do, but what I am doing, the very thing I hate. If I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. So now no longer am I, no one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that I am my flesh, but the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. For the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? There is much debate on whether potentially this is talking about Paul's former life compared to how it is now. Maybe he just gave an example to Christians. I think it's pretty clear to me that this is something that is very personal to Paul. This is obviously clear that to me, whether or not you believe this is a former life when he was Saul, or whether he's dealing with this currently now, this inner turmoil, this struggle he's having with the old law, the struggle he's having with sin, this inner turmoil he has in dealing in this in his life, this sounds very deep to him and personal to him. Very hard to preach this many verses this way if this has not affected you. This man, obviously in other scripture, mentioned thorns in the flesh, mentioned countless times how awful he was. He's the chiefest of sinners, and we'll get into that in a little bit later, how awful his former life was. Why in the world would you ever admit these kind of turmoils in your life? Why would you want to admit these things? Well, why is it so important at all to Paul to feel like, we got to talk about these struggles? Once again, keep to yourself. Today, that's not something you need to worry about. Those will go away. Have you ever openly admitted something like this to a brethren? To your spouse? It should be your closest companion. Have you ever admitted some of these things to even them? To a close friend? More importantly, have you ever admitted your faults, your weaknesses, your struggles, your temptations to yourself? That is the most important thing, and first and foremost, because obviously we're not going to be able to talk about it ever. We're not going to be able to get it out. We're not going to be able to deal with something if we can't even admit that we have a weakness. If we have a fault, no, it's okay. That was used to be in mine. It comes up occasionally, but it always goes away for a while. But does it ever really go away? Do your issues ever really go away? Do your struggles, do your inner turmoils ever really go away if you don't at least first admit that they're there and that I have a problem and I need to keep getting stronger and better at it? Paul realized that as Christians, we have to admit our faults. We have to be willing to rip the Band-Aid off first to ourselves, and if you are able, to each other, to ourselves, to those around us, so we can have help. Paul is not going to say I'm this high and mighty man who didn't need to admit struggles. He used them as a weapon. He used them as a tool, saying, listen, guys, I've dealt with so many bad things in my life. I was not a good man before. I'm still dealing with issues. I'm not a perfect man, but I am a God-fearing, following man. And if I don't admit these faults, if I don't tell you the things that I'm not going to get better at this. I'm not going to know how to accomplish this, beat this. I have to admit my fault to know where I need to get to beat it. Not only that, never forget the things you did. Never forget your prior life. I preached an invitation a few months ago about this. Your past is extremely important. Your bad and the good. Your bad can teach you so many lessons of the directions you no longer want to live. It's a reminder of this is not what I want in my life. And you can also use it when you're helping others who are dealing with the same issue. I've been there. I'm with you. This is an issue. And here's how we're going to handle it together. Do you push your struggles under the rug? Or do you deal with it? Dealing with it is hard. I'm not saying this is an easy thing to do. This is hard. I'm first to admit that I for sure don't always not sweep these under the rug. So much easier just to say it's just going to go away on its own. My weaknesses, my faults, we're good. We're not going to deal with that. We don't want to talk about that. Paul understood the acknowledgement of sin. Extremely important to being a God follower, to being a Christ follower, as our medicine. Admitting is first part of that. Hyper-focused on godly tasks. Let's get into what I mean by hyper-focus. Let's go over to Philippians chapter 1. Verse 18. Another great characteristic of Paul is his hyper-focus on his task. You can lean this more toward my other point as well, is his devotion, but we'll see a little difference here. So in verse 18, it says, what then, of Philippians 1, What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. In this I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayers, provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope, that I will not be put to shame in anything, but that all boldness Christ will even now as always be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose. But I am hard-pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that your proud confidence in me abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again. We're not talking about this point yet. We're about to get to it, but I want you to make a little note and a little pinpoint in verse 23 where it says, I'm hard-pressed, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is much better. Okay? Put a pin in that. We're going to get to that in our next point here. But in the context around this, or in the other verses here, Paul knew what he was placed on this earth to do. God showed him why he was placed on this earth to do. Are we all going to have the same task Paul had? Nope. I don't know if God's going to have a checklist and say, Paul got the churches at, Ephesus, Corinth, Galatia, all these churches he got, Thessalonica. Where are your churches? I don't see them. Is that what God's going to do when we get there on Judgment Day? Is that what Paul's telling us is our goal to get a little checkoff list? Paul saw a hyper-focus on the goals and tasks he had at hand for God. How do we know he was hyper-focused on those goals? He was struggling with him wanting to die. He was ready to go. Like I said, we'll get to that in a second. More on that. But he was ready to depart. What's the only thing that would want to keep you there? My work's not done. God put me here to spread the gospel. God put me here as long as there's a breath in my body. God said I got a job to do. Not one thing was going to stand in his way. Let's go over to Romans chapter 1. Verse 13 says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often have planned to come to see you and have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. I'm under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and to the Greek. Do you hear the eagerness and excitement in Paul's voice? How can you be so many times on the edge of death and, escaping from torture and dealing with the constant struggles this man had and still be excited? Because the world and the next situation is not what it is giving Paul the excitement or the sadness. He put his hyper-focus and his goal on God. And when you do that, there's really nothing that can take your joy. There's really nothing that can take you from trying to accomplish the task you had for God. Nothing can take that away from you. So maybe I'm speaking to myself. I find myself times saying, do I need to do a little better at study, prayer, and devotion? That's not a bad question. I need to do a little better at prayer. There's never, we can't do better at those things. But do you find yourself doing like a checklist? Like, I'm going to read further this year in this Bible. Or I'm going to make sure and do 4 prayers a day instead of 3. Inherently that doesn't really sound like a bad thing. But is it like a checklist to you? Is it becoming like, I know I got to do better. So instead of focusing so much on the little details like that, why can't we just put more of our focus on God? Why can't we just say, what can I do right now, today, to be what God wants me to be? That's how that's how Paul spent not just his projection of the next 5 years of his life. That's how he spent every second. That's how he said, what can I do now? What can I do in this situation? We go back to the Philippian jailer. What can I do right now? He may have not known he was going to get thrown exactly in prison. The Philippian jailer was going to be there and all that. Right then, right there, he had an opportunity and took it. Why don't we have more hyper-focus on God and His tasks? Young kids need to know how to be better at sport. The coach tells them, you got to go swing the bat 900 times and hit this many balls out in the field, and you got to catch this many balls in the outfield. You got to practice pitching 3 hours a day, and they'll go do it. And they do get better. They get better and better and better, and they can focus so good on that. Why? Why can we focus so good on accomplishing all these tasks we have in our job, and all these tasks we can do at home, and all these tasks we can do in sports and our education? But for some reason, we have trouble focusing on what the task God's given us. And we try and come up with these lists and checklists to make sure that it gets done, instead of finding a way to always focus on God and letting those other things I just mentioned just fall into place. Those things will take care of themselves if our focus is on God. Don't forget, Paul had a job. He's a tent maker. He still had relationships. He had great friends. He still had circumstances we had today, but the focus was on God. And those things were going to take care of themselves. Once again, it's not easy. That's not an easy thing. But Paul saw it was a necessity to be in the Christian, the follower that he had to be, and knew that we had to be going the way we need to go. So we have to hyper-focus and put God first. Be more like Paul. I said I was going to get to this. Remember to put a pin in that verse. We're not going back to that verse. But remember the verse where a second ago we're talking about Paul. He was ready to depart. Why was this man ready to depart? I don't think we think about this point enough in our lives. I know I do. I question myself a lot on this. So let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. One of Paul's qualities is he had eternity always on his mind. Chapter 5, verse 1. For we know that if the earthly tent is our house and torn down, we have a building for God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, as much as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. For indeed while we're in this tent we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but clothed, to be mortal, will be swallowed up in life. So now he who prepared it for us, this very purpose, is God, who gave us this Spirit as a pledge. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, but we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage, I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord. Therefore, we also have as our ambition, whether at home or to be absent, to be pleasing to Him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. If you remember the famous verse, 2 Timothy 4, 6, and 7, I ran the race, I pushed on, my course is done. When you run a race in life, usually there's a finish line, right? There is something at the end of that. He considered from the road to Damascus and on that he was on a race course. But that implies that he was always aiming at the finish line. And his finish line was heaven. That was his ultimate goal, and to bring as many people he can with him. Eternity was always on his mind. Let me ask you really quickly, is eternity on yours? And let me say what I mean by that. Not saying, I got to make sure I'm living myself as a Christian. I feel like I'm in a right state with God. Yes, you need to be in a right state with God, and if you have confidence in that, great. Absolutely. But how much, I'm asking you a question right now, how much do you think about heaven? How much do you think, I am longing for this place, and if God comes this day, I am so excited to go? Or you say, no, I'm ready to go, but I'm not really ready to go. You know what I mean by that? I am ready, and my life is in good shape. I feel like I'm serving God the way I need to, but I'm really not ready to go. What's keeping you here? Once again, that's tough. We got children, we got our families, we got loved ones. Nothing wrong with some enjoyable activities we like to do. But are those things to keep us? I ask myself that. I don't know if I think about longing for that day enough. You get too content in this life. You get too many things go on where you're fine every day going on in this life. Why is death so scary? Does it feel that we were prepared not to go but just not ready to go? Paul was ready to get there throughout his Christian life, knowing it surpassed anything we have here. Anything we have here. You don't think he's going to miss his friends? You don't think he was going to miss them? He knew he was going to see him again. His goal was heaven. And everything else was going to take care of itself. Eternity was always on that man's mind. So ask yourself in the mirror, how much do you think of eternity? Last thing. This doesn't sound like characteristic. He was Saul. Well, you can think to yourself, how can I mimic myself after that? I can't be Saul. He was Saul. So I'm going to read just this last verse, just for time, because they all are related here. So go to Acts chapter 26, really quickly. Acts chapter 26, verse 10. But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, so as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die, but if I do none of these things, accuse me, no one to hand me. Let's see. I'm sorry. That's Acts 25. I apologize. Acts 26, verse 10. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them often in my synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. In Paul's former life, he gave every waking moment to making sure that Christianity was gone. Tortured, persecuted, put to death, hated Christians. That's what he was raised. He was under the house of Gamaliel. Gamaliel felt the same way. He was very educated under that. He was very well versed in the old law. This man hated Christianity. This man was lost. So how are you Saul today? How are you Saul? Guess what? You were Saul. You may have never murdered somebody, you may have never tortured somebody, you never may have done the things he did, but this man realized he was Saul. And he never forgot it. It wore on him. You saw in his in following passages multiple times over again how much this wore on him, and that what he did to Christians, he hated it, but he used it as a motivator to be one of the greatest teachers of the gospel that has ever been. It was a motivational factor for him. You guys have been Saul. Before you have devoted your life to God and become a Christian, you led a life that was completely in opposite direction of God. So this morning, still going to extend the invitation. If you feel like, and you have not become a Christian, and you are in the Saul state here, where you are disconnected from God, you don't have a way to get to the goal that He sees in eternity in heaven. It's not in your grasp right now. You can come forward right now. You do not have to wait for the appointed time later on in the service. You can come forward right now, and we can take care of that. And if you just need to talk, we're for sure here for you there too. I appreciate you guys' time. I'm not going to say stand and sing. I appreciate you guys' time. I look forward to the other brethren speaking. Thank you.